Hello and welcome to the Worn and Wound podcast. My name is Zach Kazan. I'm the editorial director at Worn and Wound. Really happy to be joined by two fantastic guests today. Garrett Jones, Worn and Wound's photographer. Garrett, how's it going?
I am staying out of the cold and just hanging out here in New York.
Good. Glad to hear that. Yeah, stay out of the cold. That's going to be my mindset for the next, 4 months. How long do we have? I mean, it's like, who knows? It's cold today. And we just got, we're talking off mic. We got blasted by some snow yesterday. It feels like a winter wonderland here in New Hampshire. I kind of hate it, but we're going to power through. Anyway, we've also got Sam Amis here. Sam is a Worn and Wound contributor, a designer. He just wrote a piece. It's actually going to be published today as we record. It'll be out for about a week by the time you're hearing this, on kind of like the intersection of knife and watch enthusiasm, which is what we're going to be talking about mainly here today. Sam, thanks for coming on the pod. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm stoked to talk to y'all and talk all things knives and watches and whatever else. So
yeah, no, it's I've been looking forward to this. You were on Kat's podcast, Changing Gears, several months back, so we'll link to that in the show notes. I think there'll probably be some overlap between that conversation and this one, but it'll be good to sort of like reframe it a little bit, and also get Garrett's input as well. Before we get started, let's do a quick wrist check. Sam, what have you got on your wrist today?
Yeah, today I have my Seiko Turtle on. I'm not great with reference numbers. I think it's a SPR or something like that.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, and this is kind of like my go-to, beater watch. I think I wore this a bunch when I was coaching my kids baseball this last fall, but I keep I have some nicer watches that I got when both my sons were born, but this one I think I go back to the most. It's just like aesthetically one of my favorites. So
was that like an early watch for you, or a watch like it in that kind of like Seiko family? I think a lot of people kind of like start there, and it's sort of like it kind of gets imprinted onto you, like if you wear it a lot when you're just getting started.
I think for sure. Like it was one of the first that like was beyond just a Swatch or anything like that, or an Iron Man, or things that were just like lower price. Like I think this was like $450 or something on Amazon when I got it, so it's not crazy, but yeah, it was kind of the start of that. And I love Seiko, but I've had a couple others, and this is the one I keep falling back to for sure. Yeah. So
I can remember the days of sub $500, sub $300 watches, good Seikos on Amazon. I feel like we're long past that point. They're still out there, but they're few and far between. It used to be like a real abundance of those types of watches. Garrett, how about you? What are you wearing today?
Yeah, I switched it up, went back to the old faithful Speedmaster. I've been inadvertently ignoring it for a couple of months at this point, I guess. Just got sidetracked by some other things and had to dig it back out and start wearing it again. What
kind of strap have you got on? I know you like to switch up straps on the Speedy.
Yeah, I just got it on a simple nylon, just black, nothing fancy, kind of little stealthy vibes for today. We'll see how long that lasts, but
okay. Fair enough. I know you like to switch it up. I'm glad to see the Speedmasters back on your wrist after a period of neglect. Sometimes it just you need a break, even from your favorite watches, and then you just appreciate them more once you.
That's really what it is. I mean, I don't think it's end of a honeymoon phase or anything like that, but definitely missed it on the wrist and happy to have it back.
Excellent. I'm wearing my Nomos Metro today. It's the Ace Jewelers limited edition with a two-tone orange dial. I just really like this watch. I've been wearing it all week. It's just like super comfortable. Right now, it's the only watch in my box that's wound and running. So it's just really easy to keep going back to. I think actually I've been wearing this like since Thanksgiving. Like it's just a kind of a lengthy period of time, for me, but with a single watch. But it's truly one of the more ergonomic, comfortable watches that I own. And the orange dial's growing on me too. It's really cool. So. All right, wrist check out of the way. I think before we get started on kind of like the crux of the sort of like the thesis of your argument, Sam, that you're making in this article, I want to give you a chance to just kind of like introduce yourself to our listeners. If folks didn't catch the Changing Gears podcast, or if they're not familiar with some of the other articles that you've written for the website, give us a little bit of a sense of kind of like what you do and it's just like who you are, what your background is.
Yeah, for sure. At a high level, I'm an industrial designer. I went to school for industrial design at University of Cincinnati decades ago, it seems now, and found that degree through the fact that I was pretty good at math in high school, pretty good at art, and didn't want to be an engineer and didn't want to be a fine artist. So it kind of was like the perfect marriage of both of those, industrial design. I grew up in Cincinnati. Turns out there's a really world-class program in Cincinnati. So I stayed around and benefited from the in-state tuition. And then, took that and I moved out to Portland after school, and I've been kind of working in all shapes and sizes of companies. I've worked at large design agencies of about 100 plus people. I've worked at small ones. I worked at Nike for 5 years. And then, I've done startups, which was the James brand. I was a part of that company for 11 years, working on knives and EDC and everything in between. And then, since then I've been freelancing as an industrial designer. But yeah, I think my bread and butter, and basically because it's like my passions or my favorite things are small, little metal objects or, anything like that is interesting on a design and kind of execution level. I'm the type that walks into a boutique or a store and goes straight to the glass by the cashier to see what's under that before I even look at any sort of clothing or anything. So that's kind of where everything I like lives.
So your interest in those objects then kind of like predated your training and then your career as a designer.
Yeah, for sure. Like, I mean, I have them here somewhere at home, but I remember being just like obsessed with carabiners, like climbing carabiners and like the nylon rope and stuff like that when I was a little kid. I didn't even climb or anything, but I just got one and stared at it for a long time, and the form and the shape and, all these, things that you kind of look past if you're kind of, not paying attention to those. So yeah, that's just one object, but I grew up kind of obsessing over little things like that.
Yeah. Garrett, you're an EDC guy. Does that make sense to you as well? Were you kind of like similarly sort of like drawn to like how things sort of like, how things like look and like the design of these objects when you were sort of like coming up in the EDC world and later in the watch world? Like, did you always see them as an intentional sort of object, the way that Sam's describing?
Yeah, I think, really for me, a lot of it came into just the way that things were made. Like, a lot of my curiosity that drove me into EDC was just trying to take things apart and figure out how they worked. And, and I guess really the backside of that is understanding what the design was and how the intentions and how everything was, designed to look, designed to be used. Really just, for me, it came down to hands-on feel and getting that tactile experience. And then it just drove me into a bottomless rabbit hole of collections and fun things to spend money on.
Yeah. It's certainly familiar with the bottomless rabbit hole aspect of all of this. I think most listeners probably are. So Sam, the article that you wrote kind of discusses the Venn diagram, the overlap between the knife and the watch community. I think that's something that we talk about quite a bit, because there's a collector mentality, that's just common in both communities. But the thing that you did in this article that's different is you approach it with a designer's perspective, and you really focus on sort of like the parallels and how these objects how these objects work and how people think about them when they're making them, and the historical component to this. What was the initial kind of like thought that led to this idea for this piece?
Yeah, I think so I go to a Red Bar meetup here in Portland once a month, and kind of have been in different watch communities and everything. And like over the last few years of going to that meetup, like I slowly you'd see pocket clips of people like having a knife in their pocket at these meetups, and slowly you start talking about that a little bit. And I started to realize that not everybody in that room at all, but I would say 30% were like had a pocket knife or were interested in them. And it kind of started to unwrap this other discussion besides just watches within that group. And I realized that people were into kind of the same other rabbit holes I was into. So, obviously I think I mentioned kind of lightheartedly and the thing that cars is another one that people are into, but like you can't take more than two of those or more than one of those to a meetup, and you can't store
certainly not most meetups. Most meetups are not car friendly in that particular way.
Yeah. And, luckily I'm not all that into cars. It's not one of my passions, but, I think knives really kind of became something that I looked at, when I started working at the James brand, and it turned into something that I realized I was into when I was younger as well, whether it was Boy Scouts or my grandpa's like collection of sabers that he got from World War II, that I used to look at every time we went over there. So yeah, I realized that there was people that were into that as well. And then the fact that I started to realize as I was designing both that there's so many, similarities between the two products as far as things go.
Yeah. We'll definitely get to those similarities. I want to clock that we were talking back when this piece, before you had written it and when we were sort of like discussing it, I was telling you about like my first experience going to a watch meetup that I now go to, on a monthly basis, and just realizing that like it's also a knife meetup because like everyone has, not everyone, but like a significant, percentage of folks attending that meetup are also like knife collectors and knife guys, and they have their watch roll and they have their knife roll, and it's like, it's just both kind of things together. And that really like blew my mind, when I first experienced that, because I think I was aware that like pocket knives were a thing and people, collected them, and, that there were nice pocket knives, but I just didn't click for me that there was an overlap. So that was like a really kind of like light bulb moment for me.
Yeah.
Garrett, it's interesting because you're newer to the watch community. Like you kind of got your start, in EDC. Have you brought your like a knife roll like to a watch meetup? Have you had a similar experience? Like what's your experience been with the overlap between the two communities coming like from the other side of it?
Yeah, I mean, it's completely different. I really didn't get heavily into watches until I was up here in New York, and the rules and regulations around carrying sharp things in New York are very, very strict, to the point where most people won't even let their pocket clip be seen. So it's kind of it's a very subtle thing to see one at a meetup. There's not nearly as many, knives out on the table as watches at the meetups that I've been to. But I think kind of a good flip to that is, when I'm at Blade Show, you're talking about knives for 3 days straight. And as much as we all love knives and gear, it gets a little overwhelming. So I've, been able to make some really good connections and start conversations by going up to somebody and be like, hey, you got a Tudor on, or you got a whatever on your wrist. Let's chat about that for 5 minutes. And it, the same mentality, but just a different avenue to come in and form relationships.
Yeah. Sam, one of the interesting points you make in your article is this idea of custom knives, or like kind of like high spec knives, one-off pieces versus the mass-produced type of pocket knife that's significantly more common. And you make a point that there are knife makers who kind of like play in both ends of the pool. They produce, or they design knives for large brands who make them by the thousands, and then they have their own lines that can be customized and are much more expensive. And that's not a model that the watch industry has used traditionally, although I'd argue that we are starting to see it a little bit with some of these diffusion lines, the matte editions, for example, is a good one. Also Korono Tokyo, Hajime Isoka's line. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts on why that's not really a thing in the watch community, at least in the way that it is in the knife community.
Yeah, no, it's something I realized over time. And one thing I think the initial unlock for that I don't really mention in the article, but I mentioned my Seiko was like $450. That's a high-end folder production. That's this Sebenza right here. That's that's like a very high-end pocket knife, and that's Seiko is a very budget-friendly watch. So the highest of knives essentially goes to the bottom of watches. So the delta between the most expensive watch and the most expensive knife is pretty far. So that kind of lends itself to that. Whereas, watchmaking is very, very technical and very small and very, intimate in that sense. And knife making can be too, but it's also something that we've done for way longer as humans than we have for watchmaking, whether it's as a blacksmith forging a knife. And so I think, there's my friend Lucas Burnley who lives in Bend, Oregon. He does custom knives, that are north of $2,000. And, he makes a batch of 4 or 5 at a time, and he'll be at a show and those will sell out and people run to his table and try and buy them, and they sell out in seconds. And he also has knives at Boker or CRKT that he sells by the tens of thousands because he designs them and they produce them at a much, much better price. So it's an interesting thing because it's also like the one world within industrial design where you can actually earn royalties. You know, you design a knife for Kershaw and that knife, every time that sells, you get 2 to 3% on that sale. So
interesting.
Yeah.
It's the other thing that strikes me about this is that like it seems like it's accepted in the knife community that a designer will, you know, kind of like do something for the mass market and also, you know, like Lucas have, you know, his own line of, you know, like higher end custom stuff. In the watch world, there's this kind of you know, we talk about it a lot. There's sort of this like inherent snobbery around luxury watches, and you know, like the conversation for years around like Grand Seiko, for example, before things kind of like started rolling for them, you know, they were sort of like an insider's secret, and a lot of people just kind of like turned their noses up and said, I don't want something that says Seiko on the dial. And back then, like they literally did say Seiko on the dial. They said Seiko and then signed Grand Seiko as well. So it's not as it's not as accepted in the watch world, I think, to kind of like serve both markets. It's, you know, in the watch world, there's a point of pride when something is like, you know, has a 5-figure price tag. You know, we see brands kind of trying to position themselves to compete with Rolex or, you know, other brands at a higher price point by artificially increasing their price. Omega is a good example, you know, of this that people point to sometimes. So that's another thing that I think is a factor here.
Yep. Yeah.
Garrett, does that follow along with your kind of like experience in the knife world, kind of, you know, like designers dipping into both multiple sides of the market?
Yeah, I think one of the things that kind of like, you know, and I'm thinking about this as you're talking about it, one of the things that kind of makes it, you know, quote, okay, so to speak, is that when you have people that are doing design work for KT or any of the other numerous companies that license designs, it's a massive production facility that makes those quote unquote lower end entry level pieces. Whereas when you go up market, even if it's same designer, it often becomes smaller production run, either, you know, completely in house or they're making them one offs by themselves. And so there's so much more time and energy that goes into those high end, low production pieces. Whereas if you look at the watch industry kind of flipping that model, you know, if Grand Seiko or Rolex or anybody was to have this massive production facility and makes, you know, quote unquote higher end watches at, you know, let's say entry level price points for that brand, for them to turn around, use the same machinery, same designer, same time, and make something that was 4 or 5 times the price kind of has a bit of stink on it because it's the same equipment, same inputs, but vastly different outcomes at the end when retail price.
Yeah, there's a lot of price sensitivity involved in the equation there, and I think, you know, to your point, Sam, like the you know, it seems like, I mean, obviously there are expensive knives, but you know, the most expensive knives are not, you know, as expensive as the most expensive watches. So you're talking about a lower cost product at the end of the day. So I think there's a little bit more natural sort of like acceptance there, probably.
Yeah. And there's still that same like, you know, this knife is too expensive argument for sure in the knife world. You know, there's till the end of time there's that argument, but
sure.
And you know, and like I have this Leatherman Arc here, and this thing's only $250, and it's like extremely useful as an object, but like to some people this is way too expensive for a tool to be used. But like my use that I use that for is like a lot more than I actually use my watch that costs twice that, you know. So
yeah
there's kind of this price to like value and use ratio, I guess. So
sure. And the watch that costs twice that, you know, many more multiples of that is, you know, like then you're getting into like the luxury, you know, category at that point. And I know there are luxury knives and luxury tools, of course, but you know, like they literally are tools. You know, like the idea of a tool watch is like an antiquated thing, but I think like the idea of a knife as a tool is not.
Right.
You know, people, you know, obviously are using knives for practical things every day. You know, you're wearing a dive watch or a, you know, Speedmaster, you know, for example, doesn't mean you're, you know, going to the moon or, you know, racing a car around a track or whatever. But you're more likely to probably use a knife, I would say, if you happen to carry one.
Yeah, totally.
You make a lot of kind of analogies in terms of like the nature of like knife and watch design in your article, Sam. Like you talk about how movements are comparable to like the steel alloys that are used and crowns versus thumb studs on knives. Were there any that you didn't include in the article that like were kind of like leftover, or any that like kind of like surprised you when you sort of like started thinking about that? And are there any that like, what do you want folks to really kind of like think about when they're when they're reading your article? Like what should people kind of like, what's the lasting connection you want people to make there?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really think of any that I may have left out. I'm sure there's plenty, but like when it comes to watches, like, obviously I think on both, it's like the smartest thing to do is buy the thing you like. Like that's the end goal of both of these rabbit holes, is like, like don't just chase the knife because it's the popular thing at the moment or whatever. But at a high level, like watch, like, you could basically say like it's movement, case, and strap, or like the three. And then within knives, it would be like blade steel, lock type, and handle material, or scales is what they're called. And so those three would like kind of be the ones that you kind of like look at and choose. But at the end of the day as well, like it's, you want to like, what's your use case? Do you need a 3.5 inch folder today, or are you gonna use your Leatherman Arc and use more tools? And then for like watches, I mentioned kind of my G-Shock that I use as well while I coach my sons in sports, and then I'll wear my Speedmaster if I'm out and about in town or whatever. So just I think when it comes down to it, like the easiest one is the movement and the steel, because those are kind of like blade steel is the thing that's nitpicked till the end of time on forums and Instagram comments, and then of course movement is as well. So I think those two are like the high level deciders of direction that you go, and then from there it kind of like gets less and less. So
yeah. Garrett, I see you nodding your head. Is that a connection that you've made in the past, or do you see any other connections between sort of like knife design and watch design that people should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the easiest one that explain it to watch people would understand, because the movement debate is, so done over and over and over again, and, with some merit depending on what's important to you, where it's one of those things that like if you put a cheap movement in a watch, doesn't matter what case it is, doesn't matter what strap it's on, like that watch is not going to perform well. And it's the same thing with knife steel. If you pick the wrong steel, the wrong heat treat, the wrong edge geometry, it may cut some well, but it's not going to cut like it should, or that steel could chip and break when you use it. So it's the kind of the easiest leaping point for watch people to go to knives, and vice versa for people to understand.
Yeah. Garrett, you made a point earlier about the kind of like regulations in New York City about carrying knives, and that's something that, Sam, you address in the article as well, through this idea of knives being a bit of a taboo. So Garrett, I'll go to you first with this, just because you you kind of like live it every day in New York City to a certain extent. Do you have any thoughts on why knives have kind of like struggled to shed that sort of like taboo edge, even though there is like a really rich like history with knives and like a really kind of like mature design culture and enthusiast community around it? How do you kind of think through that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, at its core, a knife, either to someone else or to you, is dangerous. You're taking a piece of steel that's very sharp, that its main job is to cut stuff. And while, I'd say probably 90% of people that use a knife on a daily basis are opening an Amazon box or cutting a tag out of a shirt, or, something simple that's inherently good, there will always and always have been people that want to use a knife for bad reasons, and that kind of like that stigma just doesn't transfer to the watch community at all, thankfully. But I think just because there's the inherent possibility and ultimately, a level of danger, even when you're using it safely, knives will always kind of have this, bad, scary stigma that, they'll have a hard time slicing through, pun intended.
I like that pun. Anything to add to that, Sam, what do you kind of make of like the taboo around knives as someone who sort of like, obviously like works in the industry and is, like very like tied into these products?
Yeah, I think that nails it. I think the other hard thing with brands today is that it, because of that taboo, it's difficult to sell one online. Like you can't really do Instagram advertising. You can't really do kind of all these things that traditional like digital e-commerce and marketing can do these days. So that becomes a challenge. But at the same time, I think one of the things we always said at the James brand was just put one in your pocket for like 2 weeks and see how useful it becomes. It's getting over that hurdle of actually having one in your pocket and using it, like, because you'll feel like something's missing like after those 2 weeks. And I think that's a hurdle. Like that hurdle is put there because of the dangers and taboo of a knife. But like it's one that's hard to get past for a lot of people. So
yeah. It's similar with watches, like too. I've talked to a lot of watch people who picked up the hobby sort of like later in life and had never worn a watch before, and like once you start wearing one, you find that it's useful. You find you like the way it feels and looks, and you get drawn into the collector kind of community of it. And it's very easy to continue down that path, especially if you're like predisposed to like an enthusiast world in collecting stuff. Garrett, you're laughing. I know that's that makes sense to you probably, right?
Yeah, and I think, kind of the flip side of that, especially having been so immersed in the watch world for the last almost 2 years now, is that for, watch people who have that collecting itch and bug that are used to spending, let's call it $5,000 on a really nice watch. And granted, there's a lot of really nice watches at cheaper price points nowadays, but call it $5,000 just for the sake of argument. You can buy a watch for $5,000, or I can sell you like 100 knives for $5,000. There is so many more options and price points to play around with, in the knife side of things, that it just becomes such an easy pickup for people that want to collect things, but, can't afford to buy, 55 grand watches a year.
Yeah. It's a good point. I think the ability to explore more in that, because you're not out $5,000 because you didn't like that watch, and all of a sudden you resell it and it's not worth as much. Like, I think you can have the ability to like mess up your path through the rabbit hole a little bit more in the knife world, I think. So, but there isn't much resale value on some knives, as much as like some watches.
Yeah, you're probably not going to like ruin your life if you like buy the wrong knife and try to resell it. But if there's a path to financial destruction. If you make certain watch buying mistakes, which you really should learn to avoid, I think. And that's actually a good transition into kind of like a more sort of like collecting focus part of the conversation, which is another thing you address in the article, Sam. And so obviously a similarity between the two communities that we've been talking about. I'm curious, a lot of the conversation around collecting involves like the decision-making process and kind of like learning what you like. For you, Sam, as a collector of both knives and watches, can you talk a little bit about any sort of like important moments in your like collecting journey, or things that things you learned, mistakes you've made, that sort of thing when it comes to either watches or knives?
Yeah, for sure. And we hear it all the time, and I mentioned earlier of like buying the thing you like and you're into. And for watches, I'm Tudor took me a long time to kind of get the right one. I have an FXD now, and like that to me is like a watch I won't get rid of, mainly because I got it for when my second son was born, but I actually had 2 other versions before that I didn't like as much, just down to I had the GMT red and blue Pepsi version of their watch, and I liked it, but I was just like, it didn't work for me. So it's like, making sure you just don't say like, okay, I guess I'll have to keep this because I bought it. Like move it on and find the right thing is important. And I think as well, like do a ton of research into the brands and, what their history is, what they stand for, like kind of all this stuff that we talk about a bunch, because I think, you'll start finding the brands that speak to you a ton, and you'll kind of double down on those, and then you'll discover one that's kind of adjacent to it. And I think, like, I have a bunch of, black dial divers, and that's kind of a thing I'm into, so I kind of found that niche. And then I realized that, like, when I get out of that, I'm like, I'll buy something and it has a little bit more color. I'm like, oh, that's too much. Like, I'm not going to do that one. And it's similar with knives. Like, I think you find the brands that are interesting, for knives. Like, Chris Reeves is one of the premium makers there is. And forever I was just like, I'd stare at them online. I'm like, what's with those? Like, why are those $500? They don't look anything, but you get one in hand and you use one and you try it out for a while and you're like, oh, okay, I get it now. Like, so it takes time, and there's, you're not gonna hit a home run every single time of every time you buy a knife or a watch, like, and there's going to be things that irk you about some of them, but that's why I like this Seiko so much, because I can't find any issue with it right now. I have a massive scratch on the Sapphire, but it doesn't bother me because I put that there somehow. So
yeah. Garrett, as someone who spent a lot of time in the EDC and the knife world before coming into watches, I'm curious if you found that your kind of like strategy or habits in collecting watches sort of mirrored what you experienced, and not like, do you have like a similar philosophy when it comes to collecting watches as you do for knives?
Yeah, I think kind of echoing a bit of Sam's point there, is that for me, it's really, really important, who the manufacturer is, what their, production ethos, what their design ethos, understanding everything that goes into the making of the item. For me, it wasn't important on a $300 knife. It's really important on a, $3,000 watch, or, even a $1,500 watch. It's still really important to just, for me to understand what's in there, what the components are, what makes it tick, and what gives it that inherent value. And, it's really the same philosophy, but just amplified, I guess 10 times when it comes to watches, as it does with knives and gear and all of that other fun stuff that I like to collect.
Yeah. Is there like an emotional component to it? I think a lot of times people talk about the, sort of like the emotional connection that people have with a watch, like whether it's the act of winding a watch every morning or the memories associated with it. Is that part of is that something that links the two communities and the two hobbies together? Or like, are knives just kind of like more like strictly practical for you guys?
I think, yeah, there's definitely like an equal amount, I think, of emotion between the two. It depends on, I had a knife up there that was, designed by Lucas Burnley, and just knowing him, like, that's a great, knife for me, and it depends on, I've been to Protex factory. I've been to Leatherman's factory. I've been to Victorinox's factory, and like, seeing all those, like, immediately you're just like, oh, I get it even more. And those within those brands that I have are even more valuable. So there is a lot of emotion on that. Of course, like the age old story that everybody has a Swiss Army knife that they had when they were at Boy Scouts or whatever it was. Like, the first thing they had is, that red pill shape is so iconic within a lot of us that it's, that immediately carries a lot of weight.
Yeah. How about for you, Garrett? Do you feel that, do you feel similarly about, the emotional connection, or the kind of like that aspect of knife collecting? Does that play a role for you as well?
Yeah, I mean, it really, depends. It's knife by knife. I have stuff in my collection that I've bought that's just pure utilitarian tool use, that, like, if I took it out tomorrow and I did something stupid and I snapped the blade, I'd be upset about it, but I'd go replace it. And I have, other stuff in my collection that, was a gift from my dad, or a gift from somebody that's, passed away, that I have it in the collection. I love it. I cherish it. I will never carry it because I can't replace it and or the memories attached to it. And so, definitely, just like watches that have been passed down, it's, at the end of the day, it's a hunk of steel and metal, but it does carry a lot of emotional value depending on what it is.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's something. I'm not a knife collector. I have a few knives, but I certainly wouldn't consider myself a collector or even necessarily like a knife enthusiast by any means. But, with watches, I've found, I've kind of like resisted the notion that they're emotional objects for a long time, but I'm finally just really within the last like couple of years, as I've started to like solidify a collection that I actually really like, and my taste sort of like has sort of come into focus. Like, it really makes a lot more sense to me like these days when people talk about watches as being like tied to memories and tied to your history and things that you're just like more emotionally tied to. And I think that's another aspect of it, is that like over time, you like your feelings about these objects sort of like change. Like I had a very sort of like clinical kind of like these are just things sort of view of watches for years, like even into the like years of working in the industry professionally. And sometimes it just like takes having a watch that like you really love, or to Sam, to your point, another factor is like meeting the people that make the stuff is like really I think that's really important and really adds like a really deep layer of meaning to it.
Yeah, and I mean it's way more challenging for me, I guess, outside of the watch industry to get into some of the, like, to go to Seiko or to go to some of those. So it's not easy for everyone. I will say there are ways where you can get factory tours at certain things, and I highly suggest like reaching out to anybody that you are like 1 degree of Kevin Bacon away from to try and do that if you're in town, and do it, because not many people in general like have seen a factory or understand like what it takes to actually make a product. So I think that
for sure
goes a long way too.
I think that like, I mean, obviously like seeing how something is made, like going to the factory is like, that's an amazing experience. And if people have the ability to do that, then they should. But even just like being at Wind Up and, or any watch show or knife show, for that matter. And like meeting the people, who sell them, or who founded the brands. Like you don't have to like necessarily see like the production line to make it a connection with these people. Garrett, I know that's something that we've talked about and you've witnessed, and I'm sure kind of like experienced several windups by this point. But it still happens to me, like when I'm at a windup, you make a connection with the founder of the brand or someone there, and it's like it just kind of clicks.
Yeah, I mean, I think at its core, enthusiasm is contagious in the best ways. Whether it's knives, car, backpacks, whatever it is, watches, especially when you get to meet somebody that, has poured time and energy and love and their soul into making something, and they're ecstatic about the way that it comes out. It's really hard to look at that, stand in front of the person, and not feel some level of pride and joy and happiness to share with them.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really well said. I want to just like quickly, before we finish up, I think it's important, to just sort of talk about like the design philosophy behind knives and watches and where that overlap exists. I think that like, we, if you take a knife and a watch and just like put them side by side, like what sort of like principles do you see, Sam, as a designer that link them? Is it like the ergonomics or like the symbolism or storytelling, that kind of like happens in the design, or the machining or something else that's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot, like, with a lot of products, there's like the 30-foot read, the 5-foot read, and then like the 1-foot read a little bit, where it's like, okay, from afar, I can see that Garrett's got a Benchmade in his pocket. Like I can understand, and immediately that's kind of understood. And then from afar, you could see if somebody has an integrated bracelet on, and it might be a Tissot or it might be a AP. You never know. Mm-hmm. Like those things that pull you in first, and then like it kind of gets down to the functionality. Like how useful is the blade shape of a knife? Like generally, a drop point is the most useful, but like a sheep's foot might actually be more approachable to a consumer, or to sell to somebody that is more afraid of knives because it's less pointy, it's less aggressive. And then, a watch, it's like, how legible is this thing? Like, is it fully loomed out? Like, is it super useful at night and day? Mm-hmm. Or is it just a dress watch that's super nice? So there's all these like little details. So I think a lot of, the balancing form and function is super important, but I think, both at the same time. Like I generally, like in all my articles for Worn and Wound, or, I'm a designer, so I generally look at something that moves me, or like that I enjoy more from a design aspect. And then if it functions, great, and it's easier for me in the watch world because like the thing generally just tells time. And mm-hmm. It's for me, it's like I'm going to put it on my wrist because that's what I want to be seen wearing, that aesthetic. Whereas a knife, like I will choose between my Leatherman Arc today because, I might be out, getting the Christmas tree or whatever. I might need it more than just a blade instead of my Sebenza or my James Rand Chapter or whatever. So yeah, so I think there's a lot of similarities, but like there is that like 30-foot, 10-foot, like 1-foot read of kind of like intrigue in the products, right?
Yeah, for sure. Last question for both of you. I think you can each take a crack at this. If you were able to bring one kind of like knife community, knife world philosophy into watchmaking, whether that's the culture of collaboration or the sort of like material experimentation, whatever it might be, what would you bring in to the watch world, and why would you do that? Sam, if you want to take that.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it. I would love to see more collaborations between, not only just between brands potentially or anything, but like, I think the idea of like, I don't know, Roger Smith doing like a Seiko, a Grand mm-hmm. Seiko, like something that brings his unattainable prices down to the masses would be super interesting. I won't be able to get it. There's like, as we're recording, I think tomorrow Resonance is releasing a Mark Newson collaboration, which to me is like my design world and watch world colliding super hard. And like, that would be like the ideal. I haven't seen it yet, but like I know it's just gonna be like, dang it, how do I get that? And I know it's gonna be $60,000 and 80 of them are made, I think. And so
it's cool. I've seen the press photos. It's and the article will be on the website by the time this airs, of course. So yeah, we'll link to it, but it's pretty cool.
So I think that collaboration would be super interesting. I think brands are like, Resonance is doing it well. I think, AP's done some cool stuff in the past. But I think, again, I just mentioned two brands that are north of $40,000 in a watch. So it's like, how can you bring that brand down to the masses a little bit,
Yeah. Like, I mean, it's interesting because like that is happening like on a small and kind of in growing scale. I mentioned, MB&F and Mad 1 or Mad Editions rather, Chrono Tokyo made, designed by Hajime Ahsoka. There's the Gronfeld diffusion line. His name escapes me, but I'll find the link and put it in the show notes. There's a bunch now, but I love the idea of like Roger Smith, like doing something. Actually, there's another thing we can link to. I asked Roger Smith, I had a chance to interview him, not this year, but last year before British Watchmakers Day. And I asked him about that specifically. And he was not interested. But I wonder if like the philosophy changes as the landscape of these like enthusiast communities change, because I'm sure he's seeing the success of Mad Editions and these other diffusion lines, and wondering to himself, just about like the revenue stream. It'd be silly not to consider it, at this point.
Yeah.
Garrett, how about you? What would you bring into the watch world from the knife world?
Yeah, I think a big thing for me is just the ability and really desire to play with new materials. I say new materials as in never used. One of the big things that's kind of run through the knife industry in the last year-ish was a lot of people started using micarta, which is in its earliest form was a really old material that's kind of finding new life. And, I'm just saying like how cool would it be to have a watch with a micarta dial, or a case made from zirconium or Damascus or something just really off the wall. And there's a few people that are doing that, but at very high-end price points that are tough for people to deal with, where approach, I guess is the better word. Whereas even if you're production-wise or, moderate custom designer in the knife world, just the price point and availability of weird, wacky materials to play around with is so much more approachable. I would love to see that come to the watch industry as a whole.
Yeah. Well, it's a possibility. I think that there's a lot of, right now there's a lot of willingness to experiment in the watch world. We're seeing, we're leaving, one chapter, which was, just kind of like focusing in on like, vintage reissues and sort of like acknowledging the past. And I think a lot of brands that thrived doing that have found success being a little bit more experimental and taking some chances. So, hopefully we continue to see that. Garrett, Sam, thank you so much for doing this. Garrett will be back at some point to have this conversation about keyboards. I think at a certain point, it might be a while, but
yeah,
that'll be the next point of overlap. I might not be the right person to host that podcast, but we can talk about that when it comes. But thank you to both of you for coming on the podcast. It's been a really fun conversation, and thank you to all of you for listening. As always, we appreciate it, and we will be back next week with another all new episode of the Warner Wound podcast. Until then, take care.